Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling Chapter 30 from the Feynman Lectures on Physics, Volume 1. It's all about diffraction.
That's right. And this chapter, it's a really crucial shift, isn't it? We move from thinking about just two sources interfering.
Yeah, like in Young's double-slit experiment.
Exactly. To thinking about what happens when you have loads of sources. Maybe even, an infinite number. That's diffraction territory.
So our mission today is really to get under the hood of Feynman's approach here. He uses this vector geometry, right, to make complex stuff intuitive.
That's the core of it. We're looking at how light bends, how telescopes focus beams, all using this visual method of adding up little arrows, essentially. We want to pull out the big ideas.
Okay, let's dive in then. Section 31 starts with the basics, summing up non-dollar identical oscillators, but each one is a little bit out of phase with the next.
Right. Each one has a phase difference if you're compared to the one before it. And you're adding up all their contributions. Mathematically, it's a sum of cosines.
Which sounds complicated if you try to do it with just trig identities. But Feynman jumps straight to a picture.
He does, and it's quite elegant. You represent each oscillator's contribution as a little vector, a phasor. Same length, because the sources are equal.
And because the phase difference, it's constant between them.
When you add them head to tail, they form segments of a regular polygon, a chain of equal vectors, each turned by the same angle phi relative to the last.
So the total amplitude, the thing we actually care about, error all and O, is just the straight line distance from the start of the very first vector to the end of the very last one.
Precisely. It's the shortcut across the polygon, so to speak.
And the math that comes out of this geometry gives us that intensity formula. $Y is proportional to sine squared of area Cardi 2 over sine squared of Harris eta 2.
That's the one. And it really captures the essence of diffraction from many sources.
So what does this pattern look like? If you were to graph that intensity, what's the key feature?
The absolute key feature is a massive central peak. Really tall, really narrow, right where the phase difference of fields is zero. That's all sources adding up perfectly in phase.
Maximum constructive interference.
Exactly. But then on either side, you get these tiny, much weaker little bumps, the subsidiary maxima. They drop off really fast.
So it's not just a stronger wave, it's a fundamentally focused or sharpened wave.
That's the critical insight. The large number of sources, known dollar, forces the energy into this very tight central beam.
And that formula also predicts points of zero intensity, minima. How does the vector picture explain getting exactly zero?
Well, that happens when the total phase shift across all null oscillators adds up just right. If the total phase null is a multiple of 2p, so 360 degrees, 720, and so on.
The chain of vectors bites its own tail.
Perfect description. The end of the last vector lands exactly back where the first one started. The polygon closes perfectly.
So the distance from start to end is zero. The resultant amplitude dually is zero.
Bingo! Perfect cancellation. But crucially, this only works if the individual phase step Boolean isn't also zero, or a multiple of 2 Boolean. Otherwise, the denominator in that intensity formula also goes to zero, and you're back at the central maximum.
Right. You need the numerator to be zero, while the denominator isn't. Okay, makes sense. Now let's connect this to a physical setup, say a line of antennas, space distance dollar apart. How does the angle we look at them relate to that phase dollar?
The phase difference, probably between adjacent sources, depends directly on the path difference, which is determined by dollars and the angle theta.
And this leads to a really simple condition for that first minimum, that first zero.
It does. It boils down to this. The total length of the array, let's call it $1, which is just mil times dollar, multiplied by the sine of the angle theta equals one wavelength, lambda. So Lawler sin theta lambda.
Lawler sin theta lambda. That's incredibly neat. It tells you directly how spread out your main beam is going to be.
And it shows that a longer array, a bigger dollar, gives you a narrower beam, because sem theta has to be smaller to satisfy the condition.
Okay, so if having lots of sources sharpens the beam, what happens if we take that idea to the extreme, like with thousands of sources?
Well, that takes us directly to section 30-2, the diffraction grating. It's essentially that linear array concept, but refined and scaled up, usually with thousands of tiny lines etched onto glass or plastic.
And its job is to do what?
Its main job is to split light up, to separate different wavelengths, different colors. It's the heart of a spectroscope.
So unlike the simple array focusing on the center, the grating gives us strong beams at multiple angles, right? The different orders.
That's right. The condition for constructive interference for the bright spots is now dollar times the difference in sines of the output, and input angles equals an integer multiple times the wavelength lambda.
And the key is that lambda dependence.
Exactly. If white light, which is a mix of all wavelengths, hits the grating, that formula means different colors, different lambdas, get sent off at slightly different angles for each order de Lauer. You literally spread the light into a rainbow, a spectrum.
And because number of lines is huge for a grating.
Those spectral lines are incredibly sharp, the peaks are narrow, and the minima between them are very close to zero intensity.
Which naturally leads to the next question.
Mm-hmm.
How good is it at telling apart two very similar colors, like two shades of yellow right next to each other in the spectrum?
That's the whole concept of resolving power. Can you distinguish lambda bow from a slightly different lambda?
And there's a specific criterion for this, Rayleigh's criterion.
Yes. It's a standard definition. It says two spectral lines are just resolved when the peak intensity of one line falls exactly on the first minimum of the other line. Visually, it's the point where you can just barely see a dip between the two peaks.
Okay, so it's a practical definition. And what does the resolving power depend on?
The result is remarkably simple and powerful. The resolving power, often written as lambda delta lambda, where delta lambda is the smallest resolvable wavelength difference, is equal to the order of the spectrum times the total number of lines in the grating. No lie.
So delta lambda, lambda 1, RMN.
That's it. You want better resolution. Either look at a higher order spectrum, meaning a larger dollar where the colors are spread out more.
Or just use a grating with more lines, a larger dollar.
Yeah.
More sources equals sharper peaks equals better resolution. It all ties back together.
It really does. It's the same underlying physics.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about light. What about much longer wavelengths like radio waves? Does this apply to something like a big radio telescope dish?
Absolutely. Think of a parabolic antenna. It's huge, right? It collects faint radio waves from maybe billions of light years away. How does it focus all that energy onto one tiny receiver?
It must be using the same principle, ensuring constructive interference at the focal point.
Exactly. The parabolic shape is precisely engineered so that all the waves hitting different parts of the dish, even though they travel slightly different paths, arrive at the receiver in phase. Sometimes they use electronic delay lines, too, to fine-tune it. It's maximizing the resultant amplitude, just like with the grating.
Maximum intensity from a huge collecting area. And Feynman mentions reciprocity here, too.
Yeah, that's an important general principle. The antenna's directional sensitivity pattern when it's receiving is identical to the beam pattern it would create if you used it as a transmitter. It works both ways.
Makes sense. He also briefly touches on a couple of other related things.
Right, like thin film interference, the colors you see in soap bubbles or oil slicks. That's also about phase differences due to path lengths in the film and X-ray diffraction from crystals.
Which is how we figure out atomic structures, right?
Precisely. Because the spacing between atoms in a crystal is tiny, comparable to X-ray wavelengths, the crystal acts like a three-dimensional diffraction grating for X-rays, creating patterns that reveal the atomic arrangement.
Okay, now for perhaps the most counterintuitive part of the chapter, Section 30d6, diffraction by opaque screens. What happens right at the edge of a shadow?
Yeah, this is where wave optics really departs from simple ray tracing, from geometrical optics.
Yeah.
Geometrical optics says, sharp shadow edge, light stops, darkness begins, instantly.
But that's not what happens.
Not at all. If you actually measure the light intensity very carefully right near the edge, you find some really weird stuff. The light intensity doesn't just drop to zero.
Bends into the shadow.
It does bend into the shadow slightly, yes. But even stranger, right outside the geometrical edge of the shadow, the intensity actually increases temporarily. It overshoots the intensity of the unobstructed light.
Wait, it gets brighter right next to the shadow than it was originally? How is that even possible?
It's the result of summing up the contributions from the unobstructed part of the wavefront. It's another interference effect. To calculate this, you can't just use discrete sources. You have to integrate over the continuous wavefront.
And this is where that Cornu spiral comes in.
Exactly. The Cornu spiral is a graphical way to perform that complex integration. You're adding up contributions from little strips of the wavefront. Each strip adds a little vector phasor to the sum.
But unlike the simple polygon for the Enslet case,
here, the vectors are continuously changing direction and getting smaller in amplitude as you consider parts of the wavefront further away. Plotting the tip of the resultant vector as you add these contributions traces out this beautiful spiral shape that curls inwards at both ends.
it's a complex calculation, visualized.
Yeah.
But what's the killer result? The one thing to remember about the intensity at the shadow's edge.
The most memorable and striking result is this. Exactly at the point corresponding to the edge of the geometrical shadow, the light intensity is precisely 1/4 14 of the intensity of the unobstructed incident light.
Not 0, not half, but exactly 1/4.
1/4. The fact that it's not 0 and that there's that overshoot just outside is the undeniable proof of diffraction happening at edges. Light really does bend.
Wow. Okay, so finally, the chapter wraps up with a more theoretical application, calculating the electric field from an entire plane of oscillating charges.
Right. Section 30 to 7, this is synthesizing everything. We're applying the same fundamental idea, summing contributions with phase differences, but now to a continuous sheet of charge using calculus and often complex numbers.
So we're integrating the fields produced by tiny patches of this oscillating sheet, considering their distance and phase lag relative to the point P where we want to know the field.
Yes. And again, if you visualize the summation process, the complex integral, it often traces out another kind of spiral path as you add contributions from rings further and further out on the plane.
It sounds mathematically involved.
Mm-hmm.
But Feynman pulls out a surprisingly simple final result for the field far away.
He does. After all the integration, taking limits correctly, the final expression for the total electric field simplifies beautifully.
And what does it depend on?
It turns out the electric field generated by this infinite oscillating sheet is proportional to the velocity of the oscillating charges on the sheet. Specifically, it involves 1 omega, where $6 is the amplitude and omega is the frequency.
Proportional to velocity, not acceleration. That feels different. For a simple dipole, isn't the radiated field related to acceleration?
It is, and that's what makes this result significant. The geometry of the infinite plane changes things. Summing coherently over that entire surface leads to this dependence on velocity. It's a validation of the whole wave summation approach, showing consistency even in electromagnetism.
What an incredible journey in one chapter. We started just adding vectors.
Saw how that simple idea leads to the sharp focus of diffraction gratings and antennas, quantified by resolving power.
Then confronted the weirdness of light bending at shadow edges, explained by the Cornu spiral and that 14 intensity result.
And ended up showing how the same core principle, summing waves with phase, applies even to fundamental electromagnetic fields from continuous sources, yielding elegant, simple results.
It really hammers home that wave interference and diffraction. No matter the context of light, radio, sound, even theoretical charges, it all boils down to vector addition, considering those phase relationships.
That's the unifying theme. It's geometry in action.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Think about that last result. A complex integration over an infinite plane, summing up all those electromagnetic contributions, and the final answer depends simply on the velocity of the source charges. How often does physics reward us like that, where immense complexity boils down to something so physically direct and, well, almost simple?
That elegance is often the sign you're onto something fundamental.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of diffraction.